and welcome to Talking Europe. A new political crisis could be on the horizon in Ukraine. Its President Petro Poroshenko has suffered a series of setbacks, his government failing to get support for reforms demanded by the Minsk peace deal. Cries of corruption are growing louder, and while an EU-Ukraine association agreement previously delayed by Russia's insistence has now come into force, one EU country, the Netherlands, is calling that into question. It's going to hold a referendum on the issue in April. So what is the relationship between the EU and Ukraine today, and where is it headed? Well, to give us their insight, we have with us Ukraine's ambassador to the EU, Mr. Mykola Tuchitsky. Thank you for being with us. Beside you, I have President of the Ukraine-EU delegation to the European Parliament and MEP for Croatia, Mr. Andrej Plenković. Thank you also for being with us, and hello to you. On the opposite side of the table, member for the Russia-EU delegation and MEP for Estonia, Ms. Yana Toom. Thanks for being with us, and hello to you. And beside you, I have Dutch MEP, Ms. Kathy Perry. Thanks to you all for being with us. Let me start perhaps with you, Mr. Ambassador. Tell us, first of all, this association agreement, what does it mean to Ukraine? What has it changed?
You know, association agreement for Ukraine is some kind of philosophy for the moment. It's, if you want, it's an action plan to reform Ukraine. It's about more than 1,000 pages, and it's about, you know, the concrete sphere of reform from, you know, from science to agriculture. And if we will succeed and fulfill the whole agreement which we sign, we will have completely different, modern Ukraine. We will speak not about the, you know, rule of law, which our young and people fight on Maidan, but also a new economic basis for development.
Talking there about reform, you can maybe, I know you're from Estonia, you're an EU country, but can you give us some insight into perhaps why Russia seemed against this agreement and indeed has slapped sanctions on Ukraine since the agreement came into play?
You know, I'm a wrong person to ask about Russians' attitude to this issue, but I'm also a wrong person to speak about the position of European Parliament as a whole, or even of other group. I'm not, so to say, representative of mainstream here. The first thing I want to say that I definitely voted for this agreement of association, and I think that it is a good thing. But on another hand, the economy of Ukraine is a part of old Soviet economy, and it is still dependent on Russia. And unfortunately, Europe didn't secure Ukrainian future with this agreement. I think that it will be wise to negotiate with Russia. So at the moment, okay, we opened our market to Ukrainian goods, but as you know, due to sanctions, we have big problems in dairy sector, in agricultural sector in Europe. We don't know where to sell, I don't know, Polish apples.
Mr. Plenković, how do you feel about this association agreement? The right future for Ukraine and EU, or not really going far enough?
I don't think we should mystify the association agreement. It's a classical instrument of international law, of a framework for cooperation of the countries which are in our neighborhood, which were previously also in the process of enlargement. It had different names and different substance. This is a tool, a vehicle that establishes a roadmap for the European reform agenda for Ukraine. It does not bring immediately Ukraine to the EU, but certainly does bring the European Union values and standards to Ukraine. And this transformative power of the association agreement is essential. I think it is important that it enters into force. Now it's temporarily into force. Historically, the only agreement which has been simultaneously ratified in the European Parliament and Verkhovna Rada on the 16th of September 2014. This was a symbolic gesture. Yeah. Let me tell you, this week we just had more than 60 Ukrainian parliamentarians here in the European Parliament for a unique, unprecedented event of a joint cooperation between the European Parliament, national parliaments, transforming Rada into a modern Western-style parliament. Kati Piri and myself and other colleagues who are members of the delegation for Ukraine are committed that it pursues the policy of reforms, despite the certain political crises which are normal for crisis in transition, but it takes the course of the European activities in the right manner.
Can we just then, Ms. Perry, given that you're from the Netherlands, explain to us why, you know, people there, over 400,000, signed a petition to get the Dutch government to hold this up to a referendum? Clearly, they're not very happy. Do they see it that this leads to Ukraine being membership with the EU? Is that what they're afraid of? Why would they be afraid of that?
It's clearly one of the fears. I mean, the reason why we have I believe we have a referendum on this topic now is because we have a new law which makes it possible to have referenda, which was not the case now. And the organizers, the ones who called for this referendum, and they managed to collect 450,000 signatures by Dutch citizens, which is a big success for any democracy. They even admitted it's not so much about Ukraine. We would have done it with any European topic, because the fear among many Dutch people is that Europe, the discussions, the agreements which are made in Brussels don't get sufficient support back at home. And there is a clear fear that this association agreement could lead to a further enlargement of the EU. But I believe as long as we can tell the truth, which is that this is an association in itself, which can be an instrument for further democratization in Ukraine, but it's not about enlargement, we can convince the Dutch people to vote yes.
Ambassador Tuchycki, do you see it, however, as a step further towards the EU membership? That's foreign policy in Ukraine for many, many years now has been to move towards EU membership. Is this still the case?
Yes, we see this case, but as you know, as already was said by my colleagues, first, we must implement what it was agreed. And believe me, this is not tomorrow. First. Second, Ukraine paid a high price to have a right to sign this agreement. And if you remember...
It's the source of all the tensions,
Absolutely.
really. I mean, this is what caused the Euromaidan protest,
Absolutely.
the fall of the previous government.
Absolutely.
Do the pros outweigh the cons?
To respond to your question, to be part of European Union, this is a strategic goal of Ukraine, first. Second, association agreement, as it already was said, is a vehicle. It's a tool to build new democratic Ukraine.
The government in Kiev definitely promised a reform package. However, the reformists appear to be resigning. We saw the economics minister step down, saying he didn't want to be part of a cover-up. He had been hired from Lithuania as an outside voice, a clean voice. Mr. Plenković, does that worry you?
Well, the political crisis in many of the transition countries were a normal phenomenon. Mr. Abramovicius, who has done a good job as a sort of one of those who were, let's say, foreigners in the Ukrainian government, but with the naturalization, made a solid work. Now he resigned, but the main strategic orientation of the government does not change. That is important.
But he resigned saying that for him there was too much cover-up going on, that it's endemic.
That was his statement. What we saw was that the government survived a no-confidence vote. Now we have some months for the political stability. We have spoken to all the political factions here. I think there is a maturity and the sense of common interest in the dialogue between the political parties. I don't see early elections in sight. What I see is an attempt to continue on the European path. Mr. Abramovicius has given his very good contribution. We, as the European Union, with the Commission support group, with member states helping, with the association agreement in place, we will do our part to help Ukraine go to the right direction.
We've also seen the Ukrainian Parliament reject a number of reforms put forward by the government, notably in relation to the eastern part of the country, giving a kind of special status to that. That's part of the Minsk agreement. Do you fear, perhaps, Ms. Thom, that the Minsk agreement is falling apart at this stage, this peace deal?
Personally, I'm not pessimistic about Minsk agreement. In fulfilling Minsk agreement is interested
for everyone.
Everybody, maybe except some nationalist parties in Kyiv, but I hope that as it is in the interest of European Union and also of Russia, I believe that it is possible. But on the other hand, we're supporting government in Kyiv, and at the same time, they know that the rate of approval of President Poroshenko is 17%. It is lower than it was Mr. Yanukovych before revolution. So I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately, about reforms. But at the same time, I understand that this project of European partnership is extremely, of Eastern partnership is extremely ambitious. But, Europe, we ourselves were in crisis. Mm-hmm. And are we able to help Ukraine so as it should be helped?
It should be on our priority list, Mr. Plenković?
Well, because all of our values, everything we stand for is at stake. International law, human rights, neighborhood policy, energy policy, foreign policy, it's all there. It's like make it or break it case for the EU's international credibility.
Well, on that note, let's see what came out of the latest efforts to keep those Minsk peace deals alive. We had foreign ministers from Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and of course the French meeting in Paris. Here's the latest on that.
He's describing it as a step forward towards elections for East Ukraine, but not a breakthrough. The French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault remained upbeat about the progress made.
We have emphasized the importance of the creation and adoption of an electoral code by the Ukrainian government and the parliament to hold local elections. We hope they will take place before the end of the first half of 2016.
Ayrault's Russian counterpart left the meeting stony-faced, reflecting tension at the talks. While all ministers agree elections should be held by the end of July, they've so far been unable to agree the preconditions. For the Ukrainian foreign minister, there can be no vote without a ceasefire.
The point I made specially, the necessity of providing security in the run-up to the future elections. Security first. Without security, we can't deliver on anything further. And in this sense, we need bold and robust international component on the ground.
Also in discussion, a possible prisoner swap. Kiev said there was no breakthrough on that issue either. It's now 2 years since the Ukraine conflict began. The Minsk peace accord, signed in February last year, has been violated by both sides.
Well, there you have the latest in the negotiations there. However, when we look at the situation on the ground, the ceasefire, Ambassador Chudzinski, never actually happened, did it? Yeah, each side blames the other for breaking the ceasefire.
Of course, as the ambassador of Ukraine, I blame separatists supported by the Russian Federation. And the first, second, each of day we have from 15 to 100, strike from the separatist side. And you can look on a report of OSCE mission.
But is that why the Ukrainian government isn't pushing through some of the reforms, the other reforms on the Minsk? Is this what has to happen first? How can that happen?
Partially, you are right, because when we speak about decentralization, we have had a first reading on decentralization. And the one article on project of the law about special status for some part of Lugansk and Donetsk region. And for the second reading, you must have a constitutional majority of votes in a parliament. And of course, some colleagues from the parliament, from the coalition, are against, because Russia do not respect the Minsk agreement.
Mr. Plenković, what can the EU do now then to put more pressure to try and get all sides to move on and put in place this Minsk agreement?
Well, first of all, the Minsk agreement has made a key progress. Let's be very frank about it. 9,000 people have died so far in the process of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But since the Minsk agreement has been in the implementation phase, the number of casualties has been diminished, the front lines are more or less stable, there are violations which we condemn. But what we should do is really enable the special OSCE monitoring mission in the temporarily occupied areas to perform its duties, to put control over the Russian-Ukrainian border. This is the essential element, to create conducive conditions for the early elections. Continue with the decentralization, use the series of catalogs which we have at our disposal. State building, confidence building, establishment of trust, amnesty, number of reconstruction elements, return of IDPs, return of refugees. The European Union can do a lot to help Ukraine peacefully reintegrate its territory. I know it from the case of my country, who managed to do that in 1998 after 7 years of occupation of our own territory.
So far, though, the one really active thing we've seen perhaps is sanctions. The EU has put a number of sanctions on Russia. However, we heard from Hungary's leader just a short while ago saying that he believes that once these sanctions are now up and expire in July, that a growing number of EU countries don't want to extend them anymore.
Well, with Viktor Orban, I have to say honestly, today one has to ask whose messenger he is. I mean, before EU Council Summit, he's traveling to Moscow. He's clearly one of those people who is not thinking in the interest of Europe, not thinking in the interest of Ukraine in this case, but has a personal contact with Moscow. So I wouldn't say that what the Hungarian Prime Minister says stands for the EU. Look, I think we have stood and showed our solidarity with Ukraine. Of course, it also means we must be honest when we are expecting certain reforms from the government, and we cannot look away because of the situation, so that is on the other hand. But the sanctions are there for a reason, and I don't see yet why we would suddenly, as far as I see, there is still, the Minsk agreement isn't the final solution. There is still occupied territory, illegally annexed Crimea. So to be very honest, also in the Netherlands, this is not a debate right now to take away the sanctions.
Ms. Sturm, do you think, however, that perhaps the EU's attitude towards the Ukraine is changing? Because with the war in Syria, with the crisis there, quite obviously they need Moscow, they need the Russian president.
Personally, I have a feeling that maybe due to this refugee crisis, this is, how to say, this is challenge number one to Europe, not Ukraine anymore, unfortunately. But at the same time, we need this decentralization, and we're waiting for reforms. And the main thing they can do, we can help with these reforms and provide as more as possible all kinds of humanitarian aid and consuls and something like that. But at the same time, for instance, Crimea, we do not recognize the results of Crimea referendum, but I cannot understand why we're punishing people of Crimea for that.
Okay, well, we're running out of time, but just before we go, because we mentioned the Dutch referendum, however, it's important to point out this is not a non-binding referendum, if I understand correctly, so can it change anything?
Yes, because by now a majority in the Dutch parliament has said that we will accept if there's a valid, which means if there more than 30% of the Dutch electorate goes and vote, a majority in the parliament will accept it as it is a binding referendum. So it turns it into a binding one.
So that could come right back up for debate here again in Brussels. Thank you so much to all my guests for having joined me and throwing some light on the situation there. Thanks also to you at home for having watched. Don't go anywhere though, we're back after the news. Then I will be joined by Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Ms. Olana Zerkal. See you then.